Well, thank you for the opportunity today. This is the first presentation I've put together on working with combat trauma and religion, so it was quite, though I've been working with the subject for 30-some years, it's the first time I've tried to organize it and put it together so that I could talk to some folks about that. There was an error in the paper that announced me as being a counselor with the Department of Veterans Affairs clinic out to the Walmart. I have no affiliation with that. I'm in private practice, and I have a contract with Clayton, Allamakee, and Winneshiek County to counsel their veterans. And so it's on behalf of the Winneshiek County Department of Veterans Affairs that I am here today. They're sponsoring this. As Pastor Gene mentioned, I am a Vietnam vet, wounded, been counseling with veterans for, like I said, about 32 years. I'm not going to go into a whole lot about me other than to say that. I'll answer other questions later on. So I've been asked to come and speak to you about the role of religion going into combat and coming out of combat, and I felt that what I really need to help you understand is my understanding of what combat's about. If we're going to try to serve veterans from a religious perspective, we have to try to understand those veterans and what their needs are, obviously, right? So what I'm going to do today is to target talking about the unique experiences of combat, normal responses then to those experiences in combat, and the lasting impact to come out of combat, with post-traumatic stress disorder being the worst of that. And I'll be referring to post-traumatic stress disorder as PTSD from here forward. And then I'm going to talk about treatment, and then I'm going to also get into some of the religious offerings that are applicable towards the healing of post-traumatic stress disorder. If you have any questions, there's two types of questions. If your question is one of clarification and you'd like me to explain what I'm trying to say a little better, I'd be happy to do that. But if your question is one of an association, that something that I'm saying is causing you to think about something that might be related and you're wondering about that, I'd ask you to hold that back until the end, because I got a lot I want to cram into a short space. And if I haven't answered along the way, I'll stay here until your questions are satisfied. Well, let me say that differently. Until I feel I've given you my very best answer. Now, most veterans do not have PTSD, first of all. And there's a range for those who do have PTSD, from mild to severe. They can have different symptoms, different degrees of those symptoms. But it is well understood that the more trauma exposure they experience, the greater the probability of having these PTSD symptoms. That would just make sense, right? But a couple other variables come into play. One is pre-trauma. Who were they prior to their combat? What beliefs did they have about themselves and others and the world and God? Also then, it's the post-trauma variable. Then what kind of support or lack of support did they have afterwards? So we got three different time frames here we look at in trying to understand how to be of service to the veteran. Looking at the frequency and how often the PTSD does occur, current research on the OIF, OEF, the current Iraq, Afghanistani vets, says that 15% or greater have post-traumatic stress or depression. Now, we need to understand the bulk of the veterans who have this come in well after the fact, and we call it delayed onset, okay? Because when they get out, it's show me the money in the door, I made it through, I just want to get home and get on with my life. So they might get a quick screening and maybe come back in 3 and 6 months now and get another screening. That's kind of what's going on. And out of that, they're saying, 15% or greater, they're still finding in doing it that way. But 10 to 20 years after Vietnam in 1983, they did a National Vietnam Veterans Readjustment Study, and they found at that time that 52% of the Vietnam veterans either had a diagnosis at one time or had experienced the symptoms of PTSD at one time. 52%, okay? And that was almost 30 years ago, and they're still coming in for their first visits, as well as the Korean and World War II vets. So I'm thinking that 52%'s got to be higher. I'm thinking that 15% is going to just continue to grow over time. Oops. So, make sure I got that right here. Normal stress response. Imagine you were going to work and you're driving through an intersection and somebody runs a stoplight or a stop sign to your right and they T-bone your car, okay? Wouldn't it be normal for you to feel your heart racing all of a sudden? Wouldn't it be normal to kind of throughout the day to find that, you know, the memory of that incident kind of keeps popping back into your mind, you keep seeing it and thinking about it? Might that make it difficult to concentrate at work, maybe for a day or even a couple days or something like that? Might you have difficulty going to sleep that night with this new reality under your belt? Might you find yourself driving more cautiously and then even thinking elsewhere about being cautious just in life in general? And if you go through that same intersection again, can you anticipate how you might have a little mini shudder, you know, a little chill down your back and kind of just takes you right back to that? Or if you see a car that was the same kind of car that hit you, triggers, we call them. Well, the combat and combat stress is a lot like that, only there's a lot more frequency of exposure to threat. You think about the roadside bombs, it's like every time you drive, there could be one. You don't know what it's going to be like, you don't know what's going to happen, it's just you have to kind of have that in the back of your mind to some degree. There's not really going to be a return to a baseline of no anxiety, no stress, and no worry like we're sitting here with today. Most of us, hopefully. But with that repeated exposure, what that does is that raises your baseline then up over time. And a new you develops out of that. Okay? Now that's highly functional in combat, and that's just so important to understand today. These things I'm going to talk about, highly functional in combat, but they're dysfunctional living back home in this environment. Here it's a lot less threatening, and we call it post-traumatic stress disorder, a mental illness. So what are some of the unique combat stressors? There's a greater probability for being at risk for death and injury, certainly, and for witnessing others being hurt and killed. May have to kill and wound other people. Those aren't things we deal with a whole lot here in Decorah. Environmentally, how about the heat, jungle, wherever you're at, scorpions, local illnesses that we haven't developed immunities to. And how about being away from the family and home for not just a year at a time, but doing that 4 or 5 different times? I can't begin to imagine what that's like other than the folks I've worked with. It is so difficult because when you come back, it takes time to, to readjust. And I found that when you know you're going to go, they start kicking into gear to that survival mode. So it's almost like they got 6 months really in between. And then if you're in the Guard and the Reserves, then there's those workplace worries. Is my job going to be there? Yeah, they're supposed to give it to me, but they're going to bump me down or put me on some crappy shift I don't want to be on, or, am I going to get raw deal that way? So all of these worries then going on 24/7 in the combat zone. Now where combat and religion convene, I want to read to you the definition first of what trauma is by the American Psychiatric Association. The person has experienced, witnessed, or been confronted with an event or events that involve actual or threatened death or serious injury, or a threat to the physical integrity of oneself or others. And the second component that has to have is that the person's response involved intense fear, helplessness, or horror. So, research has shown us that trauma challenges our core beliefs. Core beliefs we all have about self as worthy, others as trustworthy, the world is safe and predictable, or not. All these are on a continuum. And if those beliefs are spiritually grounded, then this gives rise to questioning the fundamental nature of our relationship between the Creator and humankind when we're exposed to traumatic events. Possible spiritual interpretations to trauma can be God is powerless or has failed to protect, God doesn't care, and maybe even perhaps there is no God. Individual responses then can be an anger at and a distancing from God, withdrawal from religious participation, and faith practices are seen as empty and without meaning. And this can result in changed or abandoned beliefs and a sense of loss of meaning and purpose in life. To address these spiritual questions, I have found my way to using Viktor Frankl's logotherapy, as Pastor Gene referred to. He was an Austrian Jew and was a psychiatrist and a neurologist both in the 1920s in Austria. Spent 3.5 years in 4 different Nazi concentration camps as a general laborer, even though he was this doctor. So he did the same thing the next guy did, going out there in the middle of winter with no shoes and digging ditches. But then, of course, being a doctor, people would come to him for different types of needs. And he had a theory of therapy that he developed prior to actually going in there that included the physical and the psychological and also the spiritual domain. And one of the few theories of therapy that holds to the benefits of looking at that also. And he says that in the concentration camp experiences, he had the opportunity to field test that. Those aren't things you can kind of go out and do a study on and expose people to that, see how they react. But he did find, as Pastor mentioned, that what got people through the worst of times was the ability to find some meaningfulness, a sense of meaningfulness that they could put with their suffering. And I'll talk more about that later. His book, Man's Search for Meaning, was his second book he wrote after he was freed from the camps. The first one was The Doctor and the Soul. But this Man's Search for Meaning, he wrote that in 9 days. And it's listed in Library of Congress Study as one of the top 10 books people say has changed their lives. Short paperback. It's the type of thing you can read over and over and over and get something out of it. Dr. Phil says he read it 50 times. I mean, for what that's worth. It's that kind of a book. You can just read it and you get something out of it every time. And I encourage people, I always give one out to my clients. The counties purchase them, and I say, read it and highlight and undermark it, and it's a tool. Use it to help yourself, because there may be a time you may want to go back and look at what was helpful to you when you went through. So I'd like to offer an understanding of how we go about processing experiences that are intense in the fear and horror and helplessness, which is what trauma is. The task is for us to integrate that experience. Now, by that, it's kind of like, you think about if you've ever used a computer and you're downloading something and you see this file over here and this file over here and you've got these little dot, 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 dot. That's what goes on. The mind has a function to go out and grab a hold of events, bring them into the mind, and file them away. And that's called integrating, when we find that file for them. That's the function. Now, today, had you shown up here and there was no speaker here, you would be left to search your files. Well, what could this possibly be? If I got the wrong day, did he forget? Is he sick? Was he in a car accident? What's going on? You're going through your files trying to make sense of what you're experiencing, right? That's what veterans are left to do, left to their own devices, to try to make sense out of some of the most horrific things you can imagine. And Frankl says that when we are confronted with things we cannot change, we're challenged to change ourselves. And that is the task of trauma treatment, to change the self, to create some healthy belief file up there so that you can take that event and file it away. Because otherwise it's out here floating. And the mind, though, because its task is to process, it keeps calling it back. But you don't know what to do with it. You keep pushing it away and trying to avoid, and I'll get more into that. So creating this file then necessitates the processing and questioning of your beliefs. I remember hearing about the lady said after 9/11, she says, now I'm left to reconcile my belief in God with what I've experienced. And do you hear what she's not saying? She's saying, isn't she saying, her belief is, God would not allow this to happen here. That's my belief, because it's not fitting. We're the good guys, right? Nothing bad could happen to us. God protects the good. So when you have no satisfactory answers for creating this file, you're really kind of left like with two separate realities straddling this, I believe this, but this happened, and, you can, I hope, sense some of the confusion that can come with this. Father William Mahady was a chaplain in Vietnam, and he wrote a book, Out of the Night, The Spiritual Journey of Vietnam Veterans. And he said that the veterans that he worked with, spoke with, they just had a difficulty and couldn't find a way to integrate their childhood beliefs with what they were experiencing and doing and being a part of. And this left them feeling spiritually alienated and isolated from God. And what about the thou shall not kill commandment? One of my World War II vets, great mind, he says, yeah, as soon as you're 3 miles offshore, you're in the land of 9 commandments. And then Father Mahady also wrote about how one of the more difficult questions for him was when the vets would come to him and say, how come it's okay I can kill people but I can't go to the whorehouse? So let's have some more confusion. You're telling me that going to the whorehouse would be worse than killing somebody, right? So you sense some of the moral confusion that maybe can come with some of this. So there's a combat reality shift that goes on. It's a whole new reality. It's a new awareness of your own imminent death, you know, that omnipotence we think we have when we're young men and women, late teens, early 20s. Nothing can happen to me. Well, this blows that out of the water. And you also have an awareness then of the fragility and temporariness of life, just how quick it can be over, and a realization of what you could do to survive. Now, when I work with couples sometimes, if I'm working with a male veteran and the wife is present, and if they have any children, I will ask her, I'll say to her, can you imagine that you could find a vocabulary to communicate to your husband and me what it's like to carry a child for 9 months and give birth? Do you think you could really explain it well enough that we'd really get it? No. Some things you have to experience is the only way. Experiential knowing as opposed to intellectual knowing. So you get these new experiences, this creates a new reality. Combat leaves a lasting fear, all right? There's a residual fear from the event itself that was fearful that stays with you. And then there's a fear of a future reoccurrence of something like this or of being hurt again. And then there's a fear of triggers that might recall the painful memory that you don't want to go to. And there's a fear from this newfound vulnerability awareness that I really could be injured or died, or somebody I love could really be taken from me. So there's no shortage of fear. Now, in looking at what causes PTSD, we have historically been thinking about this fear notion. But now, recent research is saying that grief and guilt are playing the primary role in the development of PTSD. Now, those of us in the field that have been working with this know this, but I have to think there's some politics involved here. I mean, you know, with between the military and the government and the VA, you know, to deal with the, you know, it's like you aren't supposed to feel guilty for killing people, for crying out loud. That's what we're paying you for. If you tell a 19-year-old soldier that he's going to have to go fight somebody, he'll say, bring it on. But if you tell him, oh, by the way, and you're going to feel really bad afterwards, they just might not show up. It's kind of like Vietnam. They had a poster, what if they gave a war and nobody came? Well, what kind of grief are we talking about? Certainly the loss of buddies, but also a loss of innocence, finding out one's ability to do harm and kill. A loss of self. Who am I now? I've never felt this strange, this foreign to myself, this fearful, this confused. A loss of youth. While others are back home figuring out what they're going to do this weekend to get together with their friends, the soldier might be thinking about it, they're going to make it through the next day. A loss of a sense of safety. It is not as safe as we thought it was. And there's many other losses. Guilt, 3 types of guilt. Survival guilt. Why'd I survive? Somebody might be medevaced out, the war's still on, they're home, the buddies are still there doing the fight, and I should be there with them. Or World War II vet running up the hill, guys on either side of him, they both get killed, and he's, why did I survive? What have I done with my life that warrants me surviving? And we have guilt by omission, what we didn't do. We didn't do something that we thought we should have based on our values. Maybe driving by and seeing some injured children, but you're on a mission and in a convoy. You can't stop and help them, reach out. And guilt by commission, of course, the active violation of your personal values, such as killing. So we can expect then maybe to have some value conflicts in a war. And we may have two core values going on here. Patriotism is a core value, perhaps, and so is religion, and these two can be in conflict. In 1999, I presented to the Christian Association for Psychological Studies' First National Convention on Forgiveness down in Kansas City. And the president at that time was a Vietnam veteran infantry lieutenant. And he shared his story with the participants. And he said that when he went to Vietnam, he knew he was going to be killing people. And he asked God for forgiveness before he went even. So he was trying to wrestle with these two choices and found his way to try to make some sense out of it. I think that's maybe the rarer case. But because for most of us, for many anyway, such conflicts as this have long-lasting difficulties on a person's spiritual and moral self and leaves them questioning and trying to make sense out of something that they don't know what to do with. So you kill the enemy and it's like, okay, one for the home team, you know, I survived. That's our job. But then maybe kind of later feeling a little bit of remiss that I was elated that I'd taken a human life. You know, what's that about, you know? Or maybe searching the body for intelligence and finding pictures of this enemy with their spouse and children and realizing that this was a human being and rehumanizing. But you get conditioned to not let this bother you. That's the training, and that's what the experience does. So guilt and grief can lead to this moral confusion and a sense of a disconnect between your childhood beliefs you grow up with and the experiences that you're having in front of you. Left unsure, unclear what to believe. So this PTSD we talk about, combat-related PTSD, has three hallmark features or major symptom categories. Intrusiveness, avoidance, hypervigilance. I'm going to go through them. These are all unconscious processes that go on in the combat zone. Intrusiveness then is more, we're concerned about as a PTSD, it's when they're back here. It's not PTSD in combat, it's healthy functioning. But back here, then it's the intrusiveness. It's the unwanted recall or re-experiencing of the traumatic events. What this is again, this is the mind functioning properly. You haven't found the adaptive file to let it set down into, and so you push it away by whatever means you can, but the mind still working correctly and calling it back, saying, place this somewhere healthy. But you got no place if you haven't created one. And these intrusions then can manifest themselves in distressing recollections of combat trauma, associations. You might hear a song or some noise. Then you might have the flashbacks, feeling kind of as you did just at that same time it actually happened originally, and have those same kind of feelings. Like when you went through that intersection, the car had hit you and you just kind of got that same little adrenaline rush maybe going. And of course it can come in the form of dreams and nightmares. And then you maybe can anticipate how the individual might be left wondering, what's going on with me? Why does this keep coming back? Confusion. Second hallmark is avoidance then of anything that reminds me of this, okay? Of the thoughts, feelings, associations. Again, this avoidance was functional there, because that's what helps you to shut down to your pain and your fear. Because if you let the pain and the fear surface, and you go, oh wow, look at Joe, what happened? Oh, that's terrible. Bam, you're dead. Or your other buddy's dead. So you learn to get conditioned to just repress those feelings. So in combat, time kills. Now, unfortunately, we cannot selectively shut down to pain and fear. You know, it doesn't work that way, unfortunately. You have to throw the master switch. And you shut down to all your emotions. Except our primal anger, that's survival instinct. So the shutting down then leaves the individual emotionally numb. And then so they may return home being conditioned to avoid feelings. It's like there's a flag that goes off. When feelings start to rise, something goes off and you just shut them down. You don't have to think about, oh gee, I got to not feel. It's kind of who you become. And then they're avoiding the feelings. They're also avoiding the memories, pain, trying to keep that at bay. And they're avoiding triggers of anything that might remind them of that and take them back there to where they want to go. And the avoidance then manifests itself in avoiding people, places, conversations, thoughts, feelings, physical sensations, smells, sounds. A lot of avoidance. But the impact of this on the quality of life is, then because they've thrown that master switch, there's a difficulty experiencing the positive emotions of love and affection then. The emotional intelligence we talk about, they're less tuned in with where their partner's at. A lot of vets come in and they, I don't know, I came home and she and the furniture and the kids were all gone. Didn't see it coming. Not tuned in. And then trying to prevent themselves from being exposed to the memories and the triggers and the associations, then they isolate themselves more to not go out and risk bumping into that. The world then becomes narrower and limited for them. This also then unfortunately reduces the chances for recovery because they're avoiding what they need to be facing. At a vet, his wife, she tells me I'm like a robot. It's just all the logic part of that. The emotional component is missing in action here. Another vet talked about how his buddy suicided and he didn't go to the funeral or the wake, and he said, well, I know he wouldn't want me to go and get all emotional and waste all that on him, just rationalizing so he doesn't have to face it and deal with it. But this numbing, again, it was highly adaptive in combat. The third hallmark is hypervigilance. We all have a normal fight or flight response, okay? It's that caveman part of us that cranks up and gets the adrenaline pumping in emergency situations so we can fight or run or whatever we got to do. And normally that goes on, and then when the threat's passed, it goes off. But again, in combat, it never truly goes back to zero. It only goes to a less guarded position, but there's still that higher baseline. Still got to be ready to rock and roll. And the function of that, being able to react quickly, is survival. And it doesn't get any greater of a reward than surviving. So over time, there's a new baseline for you, and you become this. There's no, I got to do that, I got to turn that on. You become it. Because again, time kills, so it has to be instinctive. Hypervigilance can manifest itself as being constantly on the lookout for danger, kind of expecting the worst, anticipating the negative, and then having sleep difficulty because you got to kind of almost have one ear going, and a difficulty staying focused and concentrating on task with things. Easily startled and upset by it because there's no A, B, C. Gee, I'm starting to get upset here. Because in combat, you have to, right now, it's an A to Z kind of a reaction. So these three hallmark features that I'm talking about here we talk about them as symptoms of a mental disorder, but they were once healthy, adaptive ways of being in a life-threatening environment. I think about the illustration of the Arctic wolf. Okay, up in the Arctic, there's a wolf pack, and they have their alpha male, and he goes out and he barks and bays at the other ones, keeping them away from the food, and he's the first one in there to be eaten. And that serves him well up there. You take that same wolf pack, you bring them back down, transplant them around a sheep farm in Wyoming. Now, those behaviors, he's going to be giving himself away. He's going to, and might get shot, and he's going to be the first one at the food, which could be baited and get killed. So it worked one place, not another. So with all this internal stuff going on, this PTSD, then that percolates into relationship issues. So now we have like more external type of problems with family, friends, and co-workers. So you can imagine in the interpersonal domain how being irritable, anger, not feeling like you fit in, not wanting to get close because that's how you get hurt, by caring. If they should die or leave you somehow. If you let them in, they might discover what you've done or who you are or how you might feel bad about yourself, so kind of keep them out there on the periphery. And then with being mistrustful, because you're always waiting for something bad to happen, how's that going to work towards relationships? A second piggyback problem then that come out of these internal problems is the psychosomatic illnesses then. So we have this stress, and if we're not healing it, it has potential to manifest itself in our bodies with the stress-related problems such as headaches, nausea, stomach problems, ulcers, skin problems. That's why we have a neck. The mind and the body are connected. Somebody told me that. A third one is the piggyback. Third piggyback problem area is then depression. So with all these internal PTSD things going on, and then now with all these relationship problems going on, we can understand how that might lead to feeling depressed. And at its worst, depression can lead to suicidal thinking. 2012 has a record for the number of suicides for the current war going on right now. And more have died by their own hand than have died in combat. And they average one a day. So coping with internal and external suffering, how do you do that? Unfortunately, many do it with maladaptive coping styles such as addictions. Addictions serve many purposes when it comes to avoidance. It can help you to occupy your mind, so these thoughts that you don't want to think about don't come in. Kind of the workaholic, busyaholic. But in Africa they have a saying, you can outdistance that which is running after you, but you cannot outdistance that which is running inside of you. I think that works here too. Addictions also serve a sense of feeling of control. I'm going to do what I want when I want. And being in control is the antidote to being helpless. One of the main responses or situations that involve trauma. A helpless, by nature, you're helpless in a trauma, or you would have done something that wouldn't have happened. So the more you feel in control, the safer you would feel. And then, of course, the addictions bring about that short-term feel-good, lifting the mood from feeling sad, mad, and bad. But as we all well understand, the long-term impact of that is ultimately just to feel worse. And the cycle continues. So, here we see then the combat veteran with PTSD is suffering of the combat trauma itself. Second, then they have the PTSD symptoms. Those hallmark features I talked about, that they're not adaptively processed in filing the experience. And then they have the piggyback relationship problems with work, relationships, health, depression, and then possibly a fourth domain of maladaptive coping styles. So here's 4 different areas where some problems could be playing. Again, normal, healthy stress responses in combat can lead to any and all of this suffering after their return. Now we talk about change. How do we change? What's change about? Well, when you're making these changes, you don't realize you're making these kind of changes in a combat zone. It's so slow, and everybody else is going through the same stuff and supporting your own change. So I had a Marine Vietnam vet said, I come back from Vietnam. He said, I thought I'd landed on the planet of the apes until I realized I was the ape. He was seeing everything different, not realizing it was his perception that had changed. But he did get it. You're this way here. You go to war and you're that way there. And then you come back and you're that way here. What worked there doesn't work here. Killing and loving are mutually incompatible ways of being. So the benefits of religious practice. So toward facilitating the healing and suffering, I borrowed from Glenn Schiraldi's PTSD source book and added a couple of my own. There's a list back there by the door with some other literature that Faith has set out there from our office. So if you want to take some of that, we'd appreciate that and pass it along. Take a couple, share them with whoever you might know that you think could benefit from learning about the resources we have here. So as I read these, I'd like you to think about just how might these serve in helping and healing, assisting the veteran to integrate these files, to establish that adaptive file. Promoting, so religious commitment then helps to promote heightened self-esteem, gives greater meaning and purpose, a peace of conscience, overcoming aloneness, gives an eternal perspective, gives reduced death anxiety, sharing and surrender of control, reducing hostility, providing spiritual support and social support beyond just the religious environment, and support for the family as a whole, and of course forgiveness, and praying, which is at some level an involvement with God. Now, so religion offers these benefits to a sufferer, but if religious beliefs are involved in the source of their pain and suffering, such as the thou shalt not kill, then returning to church, God, and religious commitment to gain those benefits equates to facing their pain and fear. And so religious life may be placed on their avoidance list because I don't want to touch it. Nonetheless, where pain involves religion and or religion holds the promise for healing, the need is not to avoid it, but instead to go deeper into it, to gain that wisdom couched within that's capable of healing their grief and guilt. So the task of treatment then is, as I would offer it, is to aid the veteran in confronting their fears in order to face their pain of the grief and guilt. And from there, set out to work to create that adaptive belief file system for which to file their trauma. And I use logotherapy as a framework then for this treatment approach. Logotherapy is about transforming suffering into meaningfulness, helping to establish an adaptive file by reframing it. And so how do we do that? Okay, adding. That's the key word. We add meaningfulness, add personal values to the experience somehow. If I have a rabbit sitting up here, you would be looking at that rabbit and wondering what that's about, and you'd be trying to make some sense out of that. You might think it's a psychological prop or something I'm using in my speech, or you might think about hunting, or you might think about a pet for a child. You know, might have different interpretations. But let's say that I would take that and I would place beside that rabbit an egg. And let's make it easy. Let's make it a colored egg. Now what comes to your mind? That's right, Thanksgiving. You've got to get him where you can. So, you see, I didn't take the rabbit out of the picture. I added something to it, and it changed your perspective, didn't it? You think about the rabbit as the suffering, the egg as the personal values and meaningfulness. And you add to that, and you change the perception. You can't change what happened. But, and this sounds cold, but what happened isn't the issue. It's how you interpret it is the issue. That's what you're responsible for. And interpretations can be forever open to reinterpretation. The event's frozen in time, but your interpretation is not. So, how are we doing on time here? Kind of getting kind of closer, aren't I? Yeah. Okay. A couple of quick examples here of this detecting meaningfulness in the trauma, looking for these, how do you add these personal values. Frankl talked about a physician who was depressed because his wife had died, and he was seeing a different psychiatrist for about a year and a half. And the psychiatrist felt he needed something beyond what they were doing, referred him to Dr. Frankl, who met with him and said, so tell me, so you have this wife you loved who has passed on, and you're depressed, and you can't get back to work. And the physician says, that's right. And Frankl says, well, tell me, how could this have been otherwise? Well, the physician says, I guess the only other way it really could have gone is if I'd have died first. And he says, well, what would the meaning of that have been? And he says, well, that would have meant that I'd have been spared this suffering, but my wife would have been left to go through this suffering. Frankl says, okay, so if you could have chosen, which way would you rather have had it? That your wife would go through this suffering and experience this suffering, or that you spared her that suffering by you going through it? He says, I guess I would rather go through it than her. And he saw the value, the personal meaningfulness in it. Got up, went back to work. So sometimes the values are couched within the experiences, but we sometimes need some help to kind of look back there and find them. But sometimes there's no values, no personal values in that. But we can still create something on our own to come out of it. And Candace Leitner did this when her daughter was hit and killed by a drunk driver, and she founded Mothers Against Drunk Driving. She didn't bring her daughter back, but she gave her daughter's life and her daughter's death personal value and meaningfulness by trying to reach out and help prevent other people from having to go through what she went through. So Frankl says the meaning of suffering is to prevent us from developing apathy and indifference toward the suffering of others. Instead of seeing suffering as a stumbling block, to consider it as a stepping stone. The aim is to transform the suffering into post-traumatic growth, becoming more of your potential instead of a disorder. And logotherapy focuses on what's still right with the individual. So healing grief, Frankl suggests we honor the loss by honoring the life of the deceased. And so I'll suggest to the vets to consider living your life for this buddy that died. How would he want you to be living? Would he want you to be another victim? And then the survival guilt, we get stuck asking why when there's not going to be an answer. Okay? I tell them if God comes down and tells you, you call me. So what they need to understand is that the task is to shift then from why to what now. Okay? That's what I'm responsible for. What happens because of me. I'm not responsible for what happens to me. And I have to think, what now? And the way I respond to that will be my own answer to the why. In guilt, then the meaning of the guilt then is to teach us how to be a better person. You give your guilt then a positive meaning by the way you use it towards being this better person. So you add that egg, you reframe it, you learn from it, you grow from it. Spiritual treatment, Frankl says there is a relationship between spiritual and psychological health. I sometimes will give out Bibles or make referrals to their spiritual leaders or have accompanied them to visits with their spiritual leaders. Yeah.
Official thing is over if any of you have to do anything, but I think this is great. So
Okay, well thank you. I'll be happy.
you have played.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, if you need to leave, please feel free. I understand that. This is about me being too windy. So what can we do about then the treatment for depression? Well, Frankl did a study with suicide attempt survivors, and the last person, every one of them was glad that they didn't succeed. And this suggests that what's needed is the ability to hang on long enough to endure until those better times arrive. Okay? And this is one way, certainly, I think religion can help, where having faith inspires the hope, and the hope invigorates perseverance to persevere and endure and hang on until those better times arrive. Forgiveness, of course, is its own workshop, but forgiving the self, it's about, again, the lesson to be learned about that unforgiven guilt. Where's the opportunity for me to grow and be the better person? But you got to face it. And then forgiving others, I've developed 3 different lists. One was so why people don't forgive, what happens when we don't forgive, and then what happens because of forgiveness. And going through these one at a time helps to understand where the roadblock and the barriers are at and where our work lies, and what maybe would be motivating to this individual to help them in their growth. In closing, the community must be willing to bear witness and endure listening to the veteran's suffering, and the veteran needs to be willing to talk about their pain. You're only as sick as your secrets. So I'm going to just read here this last closing remark, and then I'll open it to questions here. So research is showing that spiritual beliefs going into combat may influence the survivor's ability to make meaning out of the trauma, which is the signature task of trauma. Thank you. Several studies show negative thoughts and attributions about God. For example, God has abandoned me, God has punished me, or being angry at God are associated with poor clinical outcomes. Such thoughts are also associated with poor physical health and increased use of substances. Research by the United States Department of Veterans Affairs National Center for PTSD states healthy religious beliefs are often associated with lower levels of symptoms in some trauma populations. Additionally, symptoms such as anger, rage, and desire for revenge following trauma may be tempered by forgiveness, compassion, and spiritual beliefs and practices. Feelings of isolation, loneliness, and depression related to grief and loss may be lessened by social support of a spiritual community. The religious community can provide a sense that others do care and provide an opportunity to receive encouragement and nurturance towards self-growth and healing. Trauma survivors may question their belief in an all-powerful God, but this can be a fork-in-the-road opportunity to serve as a starting point for discussion and delving into how they may need to further evolve their own belief in God that could also allow for the existence of whatever horror and suffering they have experienced. Veterans with PTSD must see the opportunity to use their suffering to better their lives and their world. Should they settle for otherwise and not use their suffering to better their world in whatever small way they can, it would certainly lead them to suffer in vain, meaninglessly, with no egg and no file. At the individual level, then, combat is always has been, always probably will be about grief and guilt. And we know that religion has much to say and offer toward the healing of grief and guilt. Therein, religion can aid in the establishment of this file to allow for the adaptive integration of grief, guilt, and fear of traumatic suffering. And while the journey out of the spiritual darkness of war may be a lifelong process, so is life. And we must remember that pain shared is pain divided. Now, I have given you the worst of it. I painted a pretty bleak picture about being a veteran, but not all vets have this PTSD, and those that do, again, have it to varying degrees, do not have each and every symptom. I've just ran through the whole gamut for you. And the many positive attributes that veterans bring to the table I've not targeted, because that's not been the intended focus of this conversation. But many things they do bring, such as commitment, perseverance, a sense of honor, duty bound. But please know that he or she values your life to the point of being willing to risk their life to preserve our way of life. Veterans have much to offer their communities, for they have been to the edge of hell and peered over it and returned to us. The religious community needs the veteran, their experiences, their suffering, and their wisdom. And the veteran needs religion, God, and the comfort of a spiritual community. Ed Tick wrote a book called War in the Soul, and he is quoted, he says, "It is our job as civilians to tend to returning warriors by bringing them into the center of the community." Now, he has a website and there's some information about a program he has called Soldier's Heart, for those interested in trying to figure out how to be that community and set something up. That's on the back side of the flyer over there that has that list that I made up of what religion offers for healing the suffering. So that's over there on the back side of that if you want to look at that. So I thank you for your time.